So welcome to the Interview Techniques panel. A huge thank you, of course, to Content is Queen for having us all here for the Women's International Podcast Festival in partnership with Pinterest. I'm your host, Youle, for today's conversation. I just landed in London from Ibiza last night, where I live, and host the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. It's an eco-feminist podcast, and I kind of talk to women who are usually empowered, strong, passionate, independent women like all of you. And they are chatting to me about their stories of activism. We talk about climate change and ecology and a lot of sustainable themes that run through the narrative of those conversations that I think is probably quite unexpected for a lot of people that probably know Ibiza for many other things besides its eco stance in the world. So that's kind of the reason why I'm very passionate about presenting that podcast, as well as my own podcast, The Reset Rebel. Again, same thing, trying to reset the narrative of what Ibiza is known for, which I feel, after living there for 10 years, feels like a real passion project for me. I'm really excited to be introducing these ladies today. It's an absolute honour to be here. And I think, once you have your why about your podcast firmly in your heart, then I think, framing that interview around, your passion and your authentic belief is really, builds the framework for the rest of it to build. So I'm hugely excited to introduce today's incredible lineup of my fellow female broadcasters, journalists and podcasters. And Roshan, feel free to start your own self-introductions.
Okay, well, hi everyone. My name is Roshan Roberts. I'm the co-presenter and co-producer of the BBC News podcast called If You Don't Know, which basically explores current affairs that mainly impact the black young audience in the UK. I'm also the co-founder of a digital safe space called Dope Black Women, which basically encourages black women to be connected with each other across the globe, to nurture each other, heal, have fun, and entertain. And with that, we have a podcast as well, which I'm one of the presenters on, and that covers a range of topics from sex and dating, relationships, to mental health, to grief. There's not really any topic that's we're afraid to cover.
Sounds interesting.
It is. I don't listen to episode 2.
Mai?
Hello, my name's Mai Davies. If you're wondering what that name is, it's Welsh. So if there's any Welsh people in? Not yet, maybe watching online. So I've been a journalist and a broadcaster for 30 years now. Yes, that makes me feel very old. And I've been a presenter. I was a presenter at Anchor at Sky News for a couple of years. I was a political anchor at ITV. I've worked in news magazine programmes, presented for the BBC, television and radio, so both audio and visual. And I also, for the last 15 years, have been helping to train other broadcasters. So I run masterclasses a couple of times a year for organisations like BBC Media Action in other countries, teaching people interviewing skills, which is one of the reasons I'm here. And because I've been doing this a long time, I've presented every kind of programme you can imagine, a bit like you, Roshan. There isn't an interview, there isn't a subject I haven't done an interview on, or the type of person I haven't met. So so it's great to see you all here, actually, and it's wonderful to see so many people wanting to kind of really up their game with the podcasting. So we're all very excited to speak to you today.
Great, thank you. So I'm Lucia Scazzocchio. I guess I call myself a social broadcaster, and I run a small production company called Social Broadcasts. And Social Broadcasts is almost like a technique, a way of enabling people who don't necessarily have a voice in mainstream media to be heard. So I find different ways of getting people into conversations. And so I don't call it interviewing because I feel like there's a bit of a kind of pedestal, like you're the interviewer and the person you're interviewing is the interviewer, so interviewee. So I guess I call what I do more a conversation. And so I try and put myself on the same level as the people I'm speaking to and try and empower people to tell their own stories in their own way. So often it's taking people out of the studio, out of the kind of more traditional podcast and radio formats and going into communities and speaking to people where they feel comfortable and where they feel kind of enabled to tell their story. And that can also be helping them kind of produce as well. But we might talk about that later. So that's me. I'm rambling. Back to you, Jo.
Well, I think it's really amazing that we've gathered such a broad spectrum and range of experience in the panel today. I think it's, probably a good place to begin is, what actually makes a really great interview. So if you want to kick off for us, Roshan.
Yeah, I think when I'm consuming a podcast, I know when an interview is great when I stop it halfway through and I'm writing notes, or where I'm like texting my best friend and I'm like, you've got to listen to this. That's when an interview is like, it's really good. Or maybe where it challenges my perception on whatever the topic is about. Or if, for example, you spoke about like climate change and the environment earlier, that's not really an area that I'm particularly passionate about, if I'm being honest. But if I was to listen to a podcast about it and get to the end, I'm going to be like, this podcast is great because it sustained my attention with a subject that I'm not naturally inclined to invest my time in. So I'd probably say that. And then if I'm presenting on a podcast or producing a podcast, I think sometimes you can get really good clues from the person that you're interviewing. So like they might say at the start, especially if they're high profile, I've only got half an hour. You're like, okay. And you get to half an hour and then they'll say to their PR person, we can extend time for 45 minutes. Or, that meeting I've got, let's just push it down the line. At that point, come on, I've done a good job. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like that's really good. And then also, I think it's easier for me to gauge it when the person is high profile, but like if they have a willingness to share it, so I don't have to send them the link. They're already like emailing me when they finish, where's this, can I share it? Or are you going to have any social clips that I want to share? Or they might say to you at the end, if they've got their own stuff, like I'd like to invite you onto my podcast, I'd like to recommend you for something else. I think those are really good clues. And then I think my other point, my last point I think for me that helps me is if I've done an interview and I'm almost startled mid-interview, or like as I'm doing it, something comes out of it that surprises me as the interviewer. I've already done the research on them, so if I still feel surprised by something, it's probably like a better interview that I plan to do, I would say.
Nice, the element of surprise. Mai.
I was trying to, because I knew we were going to be talking about what makes a great interview, so I was thinking about this, because it's such a difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because it's the kind of quicksilver, it's magic when it happens. So I think if you're kind of trying to analyse it, there's a phrase we use in news, is that, are you going for heat or light? Do you know what I mean by that phrase? So heat means it's entertaining, or it's confrontational. Light means you're going to learn something. So news you can use, effectively. So I think it's useful if you're planning an interview to work out what you're going for beforehand. Are you going for entertainment, or are you going for something that's going to educate? When you said, I've got to text my friend because they're going to learn something from this. But the best interviews for me are always what is known in radio as lean-in radio, because you stop what you're doing. And that's usually because somebody has shared something incredibly honest, which is really a lot what Lucia does. When you manage to talk to somebody and get some really human moments, that is great, great interviews, because it's something you weren't expecting. And if you can aim to get that, you will always stand a chance of getting some lean-in radio. I've got to tell you, when you say you got a celebrity saying, can we extend the interview? I had a dog time an interview for me once. I've got to tell you this, I interviewed David Blunkett, who's a Labour politician who's blind, who always has a dog with him, and we had exactly half an hour for Radio 4 and no more. And I walked in, so I set my stopwatch, because it had to be half an hour, because it was going out as half an hour. And I was watching the stopwatch, and we got to half an hour, and the dog yawned. And as the dog yawned, he said, that's your lot, half an hour, get out. And the PR man came in and said, half an hour. So the dog timed my interview. And that was a great interview.
Wow. That's definitely a first. I've not heard that one before.
So first for me, too.
Lucia.
I think for me, it's obviously from a listener perspective, but from the interviewer or the person in the conversation's perspective, I think there's something about energy. So when you come out of the conversation or the interview that you've had with someone and you both feel really energized and high almost, you know that you've had a good interview or a good conversation, because it's your... And so I know when I feel very drained or when I feel high, I know like it's either been terrible or it's been great. So that's how I can judge it, because sometimes you do feel out and you come out and you're absolutely drained, and there's been no flow with that person, or it just hasn't gelled, and then you just feel exhausted. But and then the other thing is when the person, because often the people I speak to didn't even know they were going to talk to me that day, so there's no preparation. They had no idea, this was going to happen. And so at the end, when they say, wow, that was a really interesting conversation, and I learned something about myself that I didn't know as well, and I hadn't kind of thought, in that perspective, or I didn't realize I was so eloquent. And, and when often it's people who sort of start out saying, oh, I don't have anything to say, I'm not interesting, why are you speaking to me? I've got nothing. And then they realize, then through the conversation or through the interview, they realize that actually they have got lots to say and they are really interesting and their story is really interesting. That's when you know that, something great is happening and that synergy is happening. So, yeah, it's an energy thing for me. Yeah.
I mean, I can imagine from that style of interviewing that you need to kind of put people at ease a little bit more than maybe somebody who's a bit more high profile or used to being out there in the public domain. How do you put a guest kind of more at their ease, Roshan?
Well, I guess it depends on whether or not they're high profile or someone who's not. But if I just talk, generally speaking, I usually brief them via email before they come on. And then I also redo that brief again, face to face, because I understand that some people learn in different ways. And also, if they're really busy people, whether they're high profile or not, they might not have the time to have read the email, they might not have understood something, and then they might feel embarrassed to then ask me because they think it's a silly question. So I think I would probably say I over-brief people when it comes to that. What was the question again, sorry?
How do you make your guests feel relaxed before you kick off the actual official conversation?
Yeah, and then I always, when it comes to so obviously it's hard depending on the type of podcast you have, but I think it's important to ask people what time works for them. And it sounds really basic, but you might think, for you, 12 p.m. in the morning works great, but for them, they might perform better after they put their child to bed and they can just relax. So when you do something like that, it puts them at a pace where they can probably talk longer, talk more freely, have less distractions and things like that. And just little accommodating things, if it's face-to-face or in person, I might go to the station to meet them and then have a chat with them on the way. I'll talk to them about something unrelated to the interview beforehand to kind of break down all those barriers before they actually start the interview. So before they've started, I've probably spoken to them already for about 15 minutes, and I always allocate that in my time. So if I say the interview's 45 minutes, it might actually be 30, but the first 15 minutes is me talking to them about their dog, their cat, and their favourite artist, because it makes us feel more like friends. And then naturally, when we do the interview, if it's a sensitive subject or if it's their first time doing it, they're more likely to be open with me because we've already broken down that fifth wall that no one ever talks about.
The fifth wall? Which one's that? Mai?
No, I agree completely. As Roshan was saying, chat to somebody beforehand, just like a human being. Ask them about their dog. If they're in the same room with you, make them a cup of tea, make them a cup of coffee, because that is a massive icebreaker. Obviously, you can't do that if it's down the line or you're on Zoom or whatever. But yeah, definitely speak to them beforehand. And another thing, so if I can add something, sometimes people are uncomfortable because they're not used to talking, or they're afraid. They say, oh, I'm really not very good, and I can't remember words, and I'm afraid. So find out what they're afraid of. Find out if they're afraid of looking stupid in front of their peers. Find out if they're just not very good at finishing their sentences. Because very often people are afraid they're going to dry on you. They'll get halfway through the sentence and they won't know what to say next. So what I always say to them is, I know you're going to dry before you will, because you can see it in somebody's face if you're looking at them. You can hear it in their voice. You can hear that the answer's about to trail off. So if you say to them, I know that you're going to dry up before you do, I won't let you flounder. I will jump in and I will help you out. And then do that. So be prepared to listen for when that answer is trailing off and jump in with something to hold them and keep them going. And once that's happened a couple of times, they relax because they know that they're safe with you. So if you can create that safety that you're not going to let them look stupid, they will relax, in my experience.
That's really good advice. I'm making a note of that. Wow. I think I'm going to repeat a little bit what Roshan said, but it's making people comfortable, I think. And I tend to go where people are the most comfortable and kind of make it about them and their space. So if somebody wants to meet in a public place, then I'll do that. If someone actually wants to invite me into their home, then I'll do that. Some people are really great hosts and they want to be in their own environment. So, you know, and they want to make you the cup of tea. Like you're in their home and you're in their space. So it's about being accommodating, isn't it?
There's one other thing I think I'd like to say at this point, which is a tip I would give if you've got nervous guests, is be very careful using the why question. Because when you ask somebody why, it can carry an implication that they need to have a reason for something. It might not be a good reason. So, and it can be an innocuous question. So if I say, Joe, why are you wearing that dress?
God knows.
Right. So, okay, did you see Joe's eyes when I asked her that question? They went like that, okay? I'm just asking her what she's wearing. But because I said why, people do this. So be very, very careful with the why question. You can ask the question 100 of different ways. Joe, it's a really pretty dress. What made you choose black today?
I just feel really comfortable.
Okay, so did you see her face? Comfortable face. So for what reason, you know, so if you've got to ask somebody something that's difficult, find a way around using the word why, and it'll make them more comfortable. Obviously, if it's a confrontational interview and you want them to justify themselves, if it's political or something like that, fine, ask them why, because you want to put them on the spot. But if you're trying to relax them, just use that word. Be very aware of the power of the word. Mm-hmm. In therapy, for example, they tell therapists be very careful with the why question, because it's a really tricky question. So if I leave you with one tip, it's that one. Sorry. And it's a lovely dress, by the way.
Thank you so much. Very kind.
I was just going to say, something that's also really useful, which is really easy, is to actually just send them previous episodes of the podcast.
Yeah.
Because then they have a real understanding of what to expect. And especially if it's a sensitive subject, you might send them another one which is also sensitive. And then they can already have an idea of how you handle things with care, and they feel like they're going to trust you more. And if it also, because you mentioned difficult question, a difficult subject, you might want to ask them beforehand, are there any areas of this that you don't feel comfortable talking about? Whenever I've done that and it's a sensitive subject, I've always got sometimes what they didn't want to talk about out of them, because they're like, this person actually cares about me and my story, not just like clickbait or not just like getting listeners or views. So I think it's really important to think about building trust, even if it's not a sensitive subject.
That's nice. Yeah, I think that leads us neatly on to, you know, the questions. And I think people get very hung up on the questions prior to doing an interview, and rightly so. Obviously, they are the blueprint and the backup plan and the framework for where the conversation is going to go. And, you know, I think obviously what you've said about the kinds of interviews that you do, you know, sometimes if a conversation is going so well, you might not even bother using them at all. It's more of a conversation rather than an actual question and answer. But just one experience I did have when I was working for BBC Six Music, I was interviewing Lou Rhodes from the band Lamb, and there was a bit of beef going on between her and her frontman Andy, and it was in lockdown times. And we were talking about, you know, home and what that meant to her. Obviously, we were all spending a lot of time there. And I wasn't actually at home, I was stuck in India. So actually, it was kind of an interesting conversation. And I'd actually really gone back through the archives, because we all had a lot of time in our hands, to look at some previous interviews she'd done. And he'd done an interview, the two of them with The Face, back in the 90s. And, you know, he actually said that she was home for him. And when I said that question to her, or posed that, you know, statement, she was really, you know, she really got very emotional, because obviously the times we were in and the particular moment that they were having between them, it just, you know, provided this really beautiful moment where, you know, she was surprised, because I don't think she could obviously ever recollect him have said something like that about her. And I think if you really give your guest that one bit of research you can present them with, that you've actually gone to town and really found out a lot about them, obviously also puts them really in a calm, wonderful place for them to really open up. So what, you know, when it comes to questions, how do you attack that, or how do you approach that?
Well, I think like you, lots of research. I feel like everyone's heard that phrase of like being the FBI in the friendship group. And that's definitely me. So I will look at everything, past, present, things they've done. Even if it's like really small scale, niche publications that no one really talks about, they sometimes have the best questions and answers that you just didn't get the publicity that it probably deserved. So I would do that. And then I would also use key search terms on like Google. So instead of like reading a whole article, we probably don't have time to do all of that. I'll just go on there and do control, I think it's F or H, and type in certain keywords. And it might not be things I even know they're going to say. It might just be that I'm going to type it in. So I might type in family, love, heartbreak, and something might come up. And then I'm like, I'll use that quote and maybe bring that quote to form a question. And then also looking at like their tweets and their social media to get an idea. They might be someone, for example, I interviewed someone the other day and they only ever spoke about their mum online, and I'd never heard them talk about their dad. And before the interview, I said, "Oh, would you mind if I talked to you about your dad?" And they were like, "Yeah, sure." And we had their dad was like the most important person in their life, but no one had ever asked that. And I think it's because people continuously saw them talk about their mum, so they just assumed that their dad was like a sensitive subject, but actually their dad was like their best friend. And we've got some great content. So I look at other people's stuff that they've done and think, okay, I want to know more about that. And normally if I want to know more about it, other people watching that probably did as well. And if they're already invested in that person, then those questions are going to resonate with the audience.
Nice.
Good research tips. I'm going to say something slightly different. Do your research, then forget about it. So when I've run masterclasses for people before, they're usually very short, so you've got to upskill people really quickly. So I had to invent exercises to get people to actually listen, because people, you've got your notes with your questions, and what I found was that the students, the broadcasters, were kind of sticking to these questions, and they were hanging on to these notes for grim death, until their knuckles were going white. So one day I thought, right, this is no good. I'm telling them to listen, and they're not listening. So I arranged for them all to do interviews in the studio in the afternoon. I told them who they were interviewing, gave them time to prepare their questions. They prepared their questions. We went into the gallery. I said, has everybody got their questions? Yes, great. Show me your questions. Right, there they are. And I'd go along, and I'd grab all the questions and theatrically throw them in the bin. Then you get a Tom and Jerry moment when their eyes do this. And then I'd go, you're all interviewing somebody different about something different, and I'm not going to give you any warning until you're sitting in the chair. Again, we have a bigger Tom and Jerry moment. So I'd stick them in the chair, and I'd put a different guest in front of them on a completely different subject, and I'd go, you're talking to them about this for 5 minutes. No, you have no time to prep. And then after we'd done all of that, we go back into the training room. They're all expecting me to show the interviews back to them. And I would take the DVD and throw it in the bin. I'm going, not interested in that. I'm interested in how you felt. And what did you do that you didn't do yesterday when you were allowed to use your notes? And I said, what did you do today that you didn't do yesterday? And they all had to think about it for a minute. And then they went, listen. Yeah, because you had no choice. You had nothing else to fall back on. I said, and how did it feel? And they all went, better. I said, why? Because it's liberating. And were you scared? No. And I said, what did you have to do? And they went, just talk to them. Yeah. So never forget your natural human curiosity, which is what starts you on the research, but don't leave it behind when you get in front of a microphone, and stick to your notes, because the gold happens in the unexpected moments.
Yeah, we spoke about that before.
The absolute unexpected moments. And if you, obviously you have your notes and you have a plan for your interview, but don't be afraid to push it to one side and just talk to this person and interview them. And very often, silence is your friend. Don't be afraid to say nothing, because people will fill the space naturally. Do you find this?
Yeah.
People will just, you can't do, it's difficult in live broadcasting, which is, mostly what I do, but if it's pre-recorded, which is most podcasts, you can allow people to fill the space. But I would urge all of you to practice interviewing with no notes. Whether you ever use it for your podcast or not, it doesn't matter. Just practice, chucking the notes away and see what happens. Because what it'll do for you is give you confidence that you can interview anybody at any time, which means you won't get nervous about creating a question list about a particular guest, because you know you're okay. You know you can do it. You can fly without a net. And so yes, do your research, but absolutely give yourself the gift of being able to do it with nothing. And if all else fails, who, what, when, where, why? What are people saying about it?
Not too much why, though.
No, I know. Not too much why. What are people saying about it? What happens next? You can interview anybody with those basic things if you have to. But what it'll do is give you confidence that you can fly without a net. And that is what will make you a great interview. This lady does it all the time because she's interviewing people she doesn't know. She's not going in with a bunch of notes, and she gets great stuff because she has the confidence to do it.
Yeah, you've basically said everything that I was going to say.
Sorry.
But I will. I think I do research, but because these are people who aren't in the media, and you can't find them on social media and things like that. But what I will research is perhaps so often the places I'm talking, the people I'm talking to, it will be, a lot of my work is about people's relationship with where they live and place and change and things like that. So what I will do a lot of research about is the place where they live and what's going on there and the kind of things that they might be concerned about and the kind of things that are kind of happening to, in that time period, and a bit of history as well, just to kind of, so I'm not going in with like a total novice and knowing nothing. I can bring things out, but yeah, I will know very little about the person. But yes, definitely not notes. But I guess the notes I might have is if there's a date or a name or something that I need to kind of remember, and I want to bring it up. But I do also workshops and the same, just tell people to get rid, because there's nothing worse than someone just reading out a bunch of questions. Yeah. And if you're on the side of the person being interviewed and someone's not looking at you, or they're looking at their phone, I think this is the worst one. Yeah. Someone just looking at their phone and just reading questions out to you, and they don't even look up once. This has happened to me many times, and it's really uncomfortable. And you're like, are you with me, or are you just like reeling off this thing? I want, you need to be in the room with the person, and the person needs to feel like you're with them and you're really listening. And the more you lean in and listen, the more they'll reveal. And I absolutely
it's the active listening,
isn't it? It's the active listening. So if people aren't sort of aware of this term, it's more used in therapeutic practices, and it's really as it suggests, it's this active, so you're really, really in the room. But there's also a kind of technique, which is active listening, where you'll hear this often in the kind of more in-depth, I don't know if people know the On Being by Kristen Tippett. So that kind of interview where it's about kind of philosophy and religion and the self. And the technique is to kind of repeat back to somebody what they've just told you, and then so you can take it a step further, and the interview does almost become like a therapy session for both of you actually sometimes, and that's really interesting when that happens. But it's that real kind of focus, not staring at someone and making them feel uncomfortable, because no one likes that, but just showing that you really care and you're really interested in what they've got to say. And when you do that, people do open up. And the guard comes down and they're just like, okay, this person is with me, they're in the room with me, and that's really important. Yeah.
There is a danger, I'm sure you both find this, that if you're thinking about your next question, because you can hear them winding up the answer, they'll say the last 3 words of their answer may be spectacularly odd, and you've missed it because you're looking at your next question and you can't think about two things at once. So then you'll ask a question that just sounds like a horrible non sequitur. So, try not to do that. It's very tempting. I get how tempting it is to hang on to your notes. But try and active listening.
Absolutely. I feel like there's a balance to it. Because I think when I first started podcasting, I would have my laptop on me and I'm looking at the questions and looking back at the person. Whereas now I've done so much research that I feel confident to not have notes, because whatever they bring up, I already know, because I've done everything. Do you get what I mean? But I think also, even if you don't have time to do that, when I was talking about building that relationship with the person beforehand by talking to them, you can do a quick research chat with them then. So like if you meet someone in the street and they're going to interview them, sort of like the work that you do, I can ask them 5 questions there. So, do you have any children? Okay, do you know what I mean? And then those questions I can bring into the interview that I'm doing. So it doesn't have to be sitting down and like being very like meticulous about everything you're doing. You can just do it for 5 minutes and then incorporate that too.
But do prepare, because also I do have a bit, a problem with completely unprepared interviews on podcasts where it just turns into an hour of banter and it's so boring. We need to get past the banter, like let's get to the interesting stuff and not just chit chat about what TV shows you've watched. No one cares.
No.
I think my old boss, my old editor used to say, be prepared or prepare to fail, which I always took with me actually, because I think, as you say, if you haven't got those things to fall back on, and then maybe there's this awkward, unplanned silence moment where you're really not just waiting for them to fill the silence, you've got nothing to say and you don't know what to ask next. Maybe feel slightly intimidated. There's nothing worse than not having a a little bit of a backup plan, but you know, I also do it. It's almost like cramming for an exam, where you're just reading that person's information from their website, from their socials, and you know, all the news articles. And I think, you know, to be able to then incorporate that into the questions later down the line really helps you look.
It makes you look more authoritative, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. The worst thing you want to do is interview someone and they say something about them that they think you should know and you don't know it. Your interview's finished. Because they're going to be like, why did they waste their time? They're not invested in me as a person. Do you get what I mean? It's like interviewing someone you don't know their last name. That's the very basic thing you could know. So I feel like there needs to be a balance to what you're doing.
Well, you haven't read their book. That's also happened to me. Moving swiftly on. I mean, let's talk about branded podcasts a little bit, because, you know, obviously one of the biggest things that you can develop through podcasting is a unique selling point. You know, each individual podcast that exists on this planet is fairly, you know, individual, and that's the point of starting to create your own audience, who are a unique kind of listener, who, you know, potentially you could maybe even sell that to an advertiser down the line once you've got, I don't know, say for example I was doing a podcast about fishing, then, you know, I'm going to sell maybe only 100 places, but I've got, you know, more leverage in terms of the kinds of people that I'm getting to listen. So I think, you know, you kind of need to stay on track to a certain degree in terms of the kinds of subject matters that you're covering. But I think, you know, particularly when you're staying loyal to a brand, you've got like a specific, you know, message to get across potentially, or a persona or a part of your audience that you kind of need to reflect within that. So I think, you know, these interviews obviously can go incredibly off plan, as we've just talked about, but, you know, how do you perhaps steer that conversation back when needs must? Roshan?
In regards to the persona?
Yeah, if you know, obviously this conversation is going perhaps in the wrong direction, really off-brand, and like into a message that might be almost detrimental to the brand. How would you kind of get that conversation back to where it needs to go? Any good tips on, awkward moments?
Yeah, well, I guess when you've done the preparation beforehand, you kind of know what you need to get out of the interview. And I always refer back to that. So if I'm doing an interview with someone, and it might be a long, in-depth chat about X and X of subject, I might have like 3 key areas I'm going to go into. It might be mental health, family, and love. These are the 3 that just came to my head. And when I'm in those sections, normally the podcast is like 45 minutes and it's very timed. Like the restrictions are quite tight. So if I'm on love, for example, and they start talking about their love for food and we're talking about romantic love, they might go into that, but then I'll naturally be like, I'll just say a cue, like, you know, that's really great. But going back to what we were talking about before and then steer it that way, I think it's down to you to kind of, if you're doing the active listening, kind of being aware of when it's going off track and then bringing it back.
I think you've got to remember that you're the interviewer. And, you know, it can be difficult with somebody who may be going off like an express train and doesn't breathe. And, you know, they breathe through their ears and you're thinking, this is going on for 20 minutes. And it can be difficult sometimes when somebody's maybe very high status or very difficult. And I think when we're talking about brand, also, I mean, I can't really talk about branded podcasts, but I can talk about the personality as a brand, the personality of the interviewer. Because if it's your podcast, you're the heart of this show, essentially. And one of the things I've observed, I was asked to consult with somebody the other day who was asked to be a guest interviewer on a podcast. She'd never done it before. She's a very high-profile individual, but she was interviewing somebody who was exceptionally high-profile and very intimidating. So her personality just completely disappeared when she started interviewing him because she was so intimidated by him, which means that the podcast then sounds very uneven. So the personality's there at the beginning. Hi, this is my podcast. And then the interview, she just disappeared into her shell and he took over. So it's like, you've got to be consistent. If your personality is part of your brand, as part of your podcast, is to find a way not to be intimidated by any of your guests. Because we were talking about this earlier when it's very, you know, if you've got somebody, it's a celebrity, or, you know, there's somebody very high-powered, or they're just like, there's somebody who likes to monster the interviewer, especially if you're female sometimes, that can be quite difficult, is to remember it's your podcast. It's my gaff, my rules, essentially. It's my podcast. That's true. You know, you've got to kind of go, no, this is my podcast, and you're not going to take over, and I'm not going to shrink, which takes a bit of chutzpah if somebody's particularly, you know, intimidating. But I think it is important, because otherwise your podcast sounds lopsided, and it doesn't sound like you anymore. And it's important that it does sound like you.
I guess this isn't so much my expertise, but I can speak about, I am commissioned to do things like, I don't know, around heritage or a place or something like that, and it's that you kind of, that's what I'm trying to talk to people about, and you might get someone who just wants to talk about their personal history, and it just goes on and on and on, and it's fascinating, but, it's not necessarily what we're here for. So yeah, I guess it's there is an authority there that you have to have, and humour as well. You know, you can joke around with people and make them laugh, and just kind of, if someone's sort of taking themselves very seriously, a bit of teasing sometimes works a treat, because they're just like, oh, actually, yeah, I shouldn't be taking myself so seriously. Like, I'm not that amazing. So yeah, like sometimes it's just kind of finding ways to get people back in the room with you, and not on their own agenda. Because I think more with celebrities and people who have something to sell. Yeah, they'll just come in, they have an agenda, they have the things that they want to say, and that they're going to say them, and that's it. And sometimes they'll just go on, and you might be wanting to talk about relationships, and they're there to sell their book.
But then it goes back to what I was saying at the start about, like, making sure you overbrief them. Unless you're deliberately trying to be rude, if I've said by email and then face-to-face, we've got 45 minutes, we're going to talk about these areas, I would have already asked them if they're okay with these areas, and I would have already asked them what they really want to talk about, which might be their latest album, for an example. And I'm going to say, we're definitely going to come to that. We've already built the trust, we've done the talking beforehand. They're going to allow me, in most cases when I've done this work, to just take reign and just lead the conversation, because they know what they want from it they're going to get, and what I want from it I'm going to get, and they usually then don't stare off. So I think you can get rid of all of those like awkward conversations and awkward like, sorry, we need to go back to this now, if you just do a really strong brief at the top. Because when you've done that, you've also done what you said about, being authoritative and letting them know. What did you say? It was my gaff.
My gaff, my rules.
You're doing that.
I love that. So if we're moving on to, we just briefly touched on the branded podcast and that idea of, obviously, maybe a few no-go zones, but I do like the my gaff, my rules. But, Lucia, let's bat this straight back to you in terms of, like, if you were actually just going to let the guests shine, because I know that your social broadcast work is predominantly about, actually getting under that person's skin and giving them that, elevation, if you like, to talk about, more sensitive issues.
And I usually edit myself out, so I'm not necessarily even featured in what's produced, and I edit what I produce as well, so all the interviews I do as well. So I have found ways of kind of making sure that the questions I ask are kind of not repeated, but that they're integrated into what the person is telling me. So I guess there's this thing I think that's also important is, for me, it's the difference between a conversation and an interview. I think there are certain circumstances, and a lot of what we were talking about earlier, where it is an interview, you have an end goal. It's somebody's on your show to talk about a specific thing, and they've been briefed about that, and that is what you're going to talk about. And that's an interview because there's a kind of, there's an end point. A conversation, there isn't necessarily an end point. It can, so the way I often describe the difference is an interview is kind of, you've got, I don't know, you're going for a picnic and you take the motorway, it's the straight route. There's the picnic, you're going there. But a conversation is, you might take the country roads, you might stop at a pub on the way, you might see a forest and think, oh, I'll go and see what that's like. So it's more winding, there are more, you could end up somewhere else. And I guess there are probably in those situations, in that kind of conversational thing, there are lots of things I will never use. And that's fine, because I can edit those things out, but they help to get to the things that you do want to use. So they kind of, all the meandering and letting people kind of go on complete tangents will actually sometimes get me to that end, the conversation that I really want to have. So I guess it's about allowing that to happen in a way. So yeah, I think interview is very valid. That's what you want. And you know, sometimes you don't have time to kind of let people go on all sorts of tangents, but sometimes it actually is it's an amazing thing, and just being able to do that creates something quite different.
The gold dust is in the B roads and the pubs.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. You know, you find that pub that you didn't even know existed, or that, you know, the beautiful kind of bluebells in the forest or whatever. So yeah, there are. I guess this is just a different technique and strategy, and you do these things for different reasons. So it wouldn't be relevant for a lot of podcasts.
But interviews can start off as one thing and
Sure.
quickly go into the other. And what I was saying earlier is, when you throw your notes away, don't be afraid if you had this plan to go, I'm going down this B road, because suddenly it's more interesting. You can bring it back because you do have an end goal, but don't be afraid of the meanderings if they're amazing, as you found. And
I like listening to, so some of these more conversational podcasts, they'll have like the edited version and the unedited version. And sometimes the unedited version is amazing. You're just like, whoa, okay, you have to have the time, because, you know, it might be a 2-hour thing. But I just love the tangents sometimes.
Love a good tangent.
Yeah.
I think, I had something quite similar to that, just literally this week. And I was interviewing somebody a lot older than me and definitely quite high-powered. I'm not going to name names, but I made the mistake, because the Wi-Fi wasn't amazing, of actually turning off the visuals. And I think losing that eye contact with that guest then somehow disabled my authority somehow. And then I was asking a question, and she would then speak for 20 minutes very quickly. And it was very hard to interject and find my footing with shutting her down. Not completely, but at least getting another question in. So there was sort of 15, 20-minute answers. I think I asked like maybe 3 or 4 questions in an hour. So I think, you know, that is really important to assert your authority, as Cartman would say. And I think, you know, can we also just quickly, before we finish, we've literally got one last question to talk about difficult guests. We've all had one at some point in the game, and it's probably, you know, there's still many more to come. So, Roshan, tell us, how do you deal?
Like this is trauma.
Deep breath.
Guys, it's safe space. I interviewed someone. I think I spoke to you about this briefly. I interviewed this guy. I'm definitely not going to say his name. He's a massive, massive director, and I was so gassed. I was like, this is the highlight of my career. And he was so difficult. Like, we booked him for, let's say, 12 p.m. And then at 10 past 12, he's like, can we move it to 5 p.m.? 5 p.m., he's like, can we move it to 8 p.m.? This is also not a personal podcast. I'm actually in the office doing work hours. So we're all like, yeah, we're going to stay, we're going to make it happen. 8 p.m. comes, he's on the call, and he's being extremely sexist to the producer. So I can't hear what she's saying, but I can just see, based on social clues, that she feels very uncomfortable. But she's not letting me or my co-presenter know. We just know there's something going on. Then he comes on the call, and we're asking him questions. And this is why I was going back to the thing about research and, like, knowing your guests, because a lot of the question we was asking him, he was just shutting down. He was like, nope, I don't want to talk about that. I've been asked that before. Nope, I don't want to talk about everything. He just kept shutting off. But it was like, we was asking these questions to warm him up, to get to what you was talking about earlier, that killer question. And yeah, he was very sexist and very patronising, and that's why it was difficult. But ultimately, because we had done so much research, we were able to kind of work with him and just change the narrative of what we wanted to talk about a little bit and still get a good interview. And obviously, we didn't show his real ways in the final podcast.
The outtakes.
Yeah, but in that situation, I promise you, I was near tears. Like, I genuinely wanted to cry my eyes out. And if it was my own podcast, I wouldn't have put it out, because that's how much he impacted not just me, but everyone on the team. But I think in that, you just have to be calm, try and hold the tears in, and just focus on what the end goal is. And after that, then you can decide whether you're going to keep it or not, or get rid of it.
Alrighty. Thank you so much. We won't ask. I think we're going to take some questions. I'm not sure if that seems like a good way to finish, if anyone's got something.
Yes, thank you very much. I've got a microphone here. If you can put your hand up, and I will come to you with the microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I was taking lots of notes. My name's Cassandra. I do a podcast supporting Black creatives and entrepreneurship. I have a question about, I just want to say, my day job, I'm a jeweler, but I do podcasts, so I don't come from a journalist background, so I don't have like your networks and your esteem, and you can get like good gigs. So someone like me who comes from like a random profession, like as a fine jeweler, doing a podcast, how do I get more high profile like creatives and clients without any of those kind of accolades or formal training? How do I get them to take me seriously? I've been doing podcasts for nearly 2 years. So I've showed the consistency. I'm not just some random person. I have about 8 episodes. But I don't know how to get a more higher profile person who take me seriously in this. And number 2, how do you round up your interviews nicely? Because sometimes I'm just like, thank you, here is the show notes, and speak soon. And I'm like, I really need to know a way how to, make it pow at the end, like just after the show notes. So any advice about that'd be really grateful.
I can answer the second question. Remember when I said, if you're completely stuck, who, what, when, where, why, what's reaction, what's next? Find a version of the what's next question. That will get you out of trouble if you can't think of something. I mean, sometimes they say something that you can naturally round up with, and it's a nice end point, but that doesn't always happen. So if you're kind of struggling with what to say, I'd always find a version of, so what's next? What happens next? Or what does this mean? So that it leads you looking into the future, metaphorically speaking. That will get you out of trouble.
Or 5 takeaways, or 3 takeaways. If there's anything that you could give someone to take home to refer back to the powerful points that you've made thus far, how would you summarise those?
Or
I love
what
those
advice?
ones.
What advice have you got for? It's something that either you're giving the audience something or you're taking them somewhere new.
Yeah. And I think with what you said, you can make that as part of your format.
Yeah.
So your format could be that every time the podcast ends, you say what's 3 tips on this, or what's 5 pieces of advice on X.
Or a book list that they might recommend. That's always a good one.
And with your first question, so I have 2 podcasts. One's for the BBC and one's by myself. And I kid you not, I've emailed the same person as me, and they've declined the one that's by myself and accepted the BBC one. Yeah. So I completely relate to your frustrations and like the dilemma that you're having. But I think when it's gone well is when it's someone that I've already engaged with their platforms. So for example, this didn't happen. But let's say it was Beyonce, yeah? When it happens, that's when it happens.
Could be.
Let's say it's Beyonce. You want to like her post, you want to comment on her post, you want to engage with her, you want to reply to stories. So when you then DM her or you then email, you're already someone that she's aware of, that you actually is invested in her brand and her story. If you're just like, I want to get this person, I'm not saying this is you, but if you're like, I want to get this person because they're going to get me views, they know that, because people do this to them all the time. So it's just about you being authentic. And if you don't, let's say there's like a breaking news, maybe not news, let's say there's something that's happened that's topical this week, and you want to get this person on today, you haven't got time to do all of that. It's just about being really clear in your email or your message about how it benefits them. So like, hi, I really want to get you on this podcast. My podcast is about X. I want to talk to you about X, and I think it would be great for you because of X. Something loosely like that. Maybe you can add a bit more X's than as brief as that, but just make it really clear to them how it benefits them, because if it doesn't benefit them and they are someone who's high profile, unless they're bored, they're probably not going to do it.
The other thing you could do is to get yourself on other people's podcasts as a guest. And start on a lower level. I know this is really obvious, but one of the things that also does is help your fluency. Because when you're being a guest, like we're being now, you've got to be fluent or you're not interesting. So when people can hear you talking more, being really fluent, you might start getting invited onto more interesting podcasts in your field, and then people have started to hear about you, then you are someone.
I guess there's also the thing of like sort of gradually going higher and higher profile. So starting with people, I don't know what your podcast is about, but say it was a music podcast. So starting with the people that you know in that field, and then kind of working your way up. So so because so-and-so's been on it, then they'll say, oh yeah, no, this person's great. I want to talk to them. So you're kind of going up the ladder that way rather than going straight for Beyonce. Like you're kind of
and on
working
that note,
your way
actually, I always put in my XX bit that I was talking about earlier, I will say previous guests on the podcast have included, and that'll be in bold. So if they read anything in my email, it's going to be the Beyonce and Jay-Z and the Rihanna that was on my podcast, and they'll think my podcast is lit. So yeah, I think you should definitely do that. And then another thing, obviously this depends again on what your sector is, but let's say it was entertainment. If you know someone doing a press run, that's an easy way to get someone on, because it looks better for them to be on like smaller podcasts. They seem more organic. Yeah, like if someone's putting out a film, they're releasing a book, they're writing a song, anything like that, you can find their PR person, and it's probably easier for you to get through to them that way than going direct to their DMs.
I also just want to add, though, that, you know, Instagram's a sneaky one because, you know, people don't necessarily read their emails that are on their website. Maybe they've got a PA or some person that's going to put a nice big fat curtain in front of you and them, and that often happens no matter who it is. So I think if you actually, you know, a lot of people do run their own Instagram, and if you just send them a DM, a good one with lots of X's, then you might well be surprised that somebody will reply, and that did happen to me not that long ago, so with a big basketball player. So I think just aim for the stars.
Yeah.
You never know what might
And
come
I'd
back.
actually message on every social media platform. I don't know if everyone would agree, but I said I'm the FBI. I'll tweet them. No. Twitter DMs, and then I'll tweet them and say, hey, just sent you a tweet. Instagram DMs, I'll comment on their page, hey, just sent. You have to, if you really want to tell this story, you really want to share this conversation, you have to work for it. So that's, I'll do
I wish
that.
you were in the FBI, by the way. You should be.
But I can't tell you.
Okay, I'm Emma. I run a podcast called The Curious One. So with that being said, I'm all about the questions. And we talked about it briefly, but could you guys expand more on how to really dig into the pockets and ask the questions that are more out of the box and more authentic? Especially someone that's maybe more high profile or have a story that a lot of people might know, if that makes sense.
I'd ask them a pattern interrupt question. If I call it pattern interrupt question. So if they're famous, for instance, if you're talking about somebody's high profile, they've been asked the same questions over and over and over again. It's really hard to be original. So I would start the interview by saying that, because the audience knows that, they know that, everybody knows that, we've all heard these stories, by saying something like, you know, I know you get interviewed an awful lot and you've been asked all of these questions, so I thought maybe we'd perhaps go down a slightly more interesting route and then ask them something unexpected. Because they're not expecting that, so suddenly they're sitting there going, yeah, it's going to be the same as usual, and then suddenly it's not. So now you've got their attention, and if you've got their attention, you'll get a better interview out of them. So maybe come at it from slightly left field, because then it won't be so hard to get those nuggets out of them, because they're now listening to you. They're not, oh, yet another interviewer. They're actually looking at you as a human being who's asked them something interesting.
Yeah, because high-profile people often have the same stories that they'll just churn out again and again, and it's on every single show it will be the same, and you can just see them going into like, oh, it's that story again.
One of my favourite questions is, tell us something nobody would ever guess about you, and they go, oh, and the most extraordinary things come out, and then you know,
I'm really into crochet.
you're at the races at that point. You know, you're going.
Hi, my name is Cheryl. 9 to 5, funny enough, is BBC, but I'm also a travel content curator and the first of a kind walking human NFT. And I have a quick question for, hope I get your name right, Mai?
Yes, Mai. Yes.
Oh, great.
That's
so
right.
I have a Welsh,
it's like the English word Mai, M-Y, it's pronounced Mai.
That's all right. I have a Welsh name as well, but it's not that Welsh as Cheryl, but it's also, it's Welsh and French. But my question is actually for you, because you said you do journalistic kind of training.
Yes.
Is that for speaking as well?
Yes.
Perfect.
So basically anything to do with what we do. So if standing on stage, you know, consulting with people who want to communicate in any way, because it's the same skills,
Okay, because I want to look into it, because funny enough, it's weird when I say this, but I was actually born with a speech problem, so I'm supposed to be mute. I'm not supposed to be speaking, reading or writing, but I do all.
That's fabulous. Yeah, well done.
So I've... obviously, because of where I work as well, I kind of want to like dive into that a bit more. And I'm always like, I talk for England, but when it comes to like getting better with speaking and being confident with speaking, I just love doing that. I am already doing not really podcasts, but I'm always co-hosting on Twitter Spaces. So the one I do regularly in a week is for Women Unite, which is the NFT I'm part of, talking all things about NFTs, because it's very male-dominated. My degree is actually in IT, so that's why I've like kind of grasped to it. But I want to go on your courses, so I've got your contacts.
I don't actually run courses. I run courses for other companies, so I run courses for like media action and presenting, and I do some consulting with people who want to get their presentations right. But weirdly, since being, we were talking about this, since being asked to come on here, I've had 2 companies say to me, can you create a course for podcasters?
Yeah.
So I'm in talks with one of them to do that. So that may happen. I'm not sure yet. And if it does, it'll be the autumn.
Because obviously where I work, I can do media action through work.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
My name's Sarita Fontaine, and I'm co-host of a podcast called Women Who Rebrand. So recently, I found out that I've got ADHD. I just thought I was a bit bouncy. So my question is, based on my experiences, I get a bit overexcited and go off topic, ADHD thing. So do you have any advice for someone who gets a bit overexcited and maybe goes a bit off topic?
Well, it works for Russell Brand. I mean, you can. I would say if that's
make that your thing.
Make that your thing.
Yeah. Mm.
If that is naturally you, don't suppress it. The one thing you will never succeed at is pretending to be somebody else to be broadcasting. Don't ever, ever, ever do that. You have to be yourself. And if that is you, I mean, if you're going off topic, you may get more interesting stuff than me going in a straight line. So just be yourself.
And being exciting and excited is contagious,
it
right?
is.
So you'll probably get people in a completely different zone as someone who's much more, who I guess, doesn't kind of have that exciting element to them. So I would embrace it and go for it.
I definitely think that's a USP. Because even though I was talking a lot about having time to podcast, it's because I work on 2. So for the BBC one, it's very the podcast has to be this amount of minutes. A lot of podcasts I listen to are conversational, and my favourite ones are the ones that they start talking about egg, and then they're talking about the moon, and now they're talking about trainers. I love that. Do you get what I mean? So you will naturally become aligned with an audience that wants to listen to and engage with content that you're putting out. And I think you'll feel more prouder having content that you're putting out that is you and reflects you, even if it's 10 listeners, than having 1,000 listeners and it's you doing speaky spokey and trying to act like someone that you're not. Do you get what I mean? So that sounds,
your guests will have more fun.
We have time for one. To make that your superpower for sure. And a friend of mine who's also been on the Reset Rebel, she's just launched a podcast with her neighbour, who she just moved in next door to 6 months ago, in a place called Fitty in Scotland, which I didn't know existed. Don't know if anyone here is from Fitty, but she's set up this podcast. It's called ADHD Females, and it's two women co-hosting together, and it's bouncy and hilarious and all over the shop. And that's what I like about it, because I just you never know what's coming next. It's expect the unexpected.
Okay. We have time for about 2
I think
more.
one more question.
Just one more question.
Hi, my name is Monica. I have a podcast called Health Home Hustle, and it's all about leading life from a place of abundance, not burnout. Roshan, you mentioned that before you interview your guests, you give them a really thorough brief, and that if there are any vulnerable points that you think may come up, you give them the say-so if they want to go ahead with discussing that topic. If you notice, and this actually goes to all of you, if you notice that you have a guest where you can feel like they're becoming a little bit vulnerable and they're maybe opening up on a topic that you weren't even expecting them to open up on, do you have any advice on techniques you can implement to lean into that without being insensitive to a sensitive topic?
Repeat the last part of the question for me.
So if you can feel like a guest is opening up about a topic that you're not expecting them to, especially something which is vulnerable or perhaps very personal, how can you help them to lean into it without kind of disrespecting their privacy or without pushing them further than they want to go?
If I was interviewing someone and that happened, if I feel uncomfortable, then they probably definitely feel uncomfortable. So I'd actually ask them when they finish saying whatever they've said, do you feel uncomfortable still talking about this subject? Is this something you want to continue talking about? Are you comfortable with me asking more questions about it? And then based on what they say then, will determine everything else I do after that. Because often or not, if you've created a safe space, people will talk freely, and then afterwards they're like, actually, I didn't want to say that. So before we get to that point and we've recorded an hour's worth of content that I now can't use, I just nip it in the bud there and ask. And it allows them, again, to understand this is a safe space and they can feel trusted. But on that note, I interviewed someone the other day who I knew was a vulnerable person. There was someone in the public eye that had come off social media for 2 years. This was their return to interview like they returned back to the public eye. I'd worked with them over 3 months, talking to different people, and made sure they had a mental health advisor, they were getting support. And on the day, as I was interviewing them, I suddenly felt like this person wasn't in the correct frame of mind to do this interview. And so I stopped it and like got them a cab home, and we didn't put the interview out because I was like, this person wasn't in the best place. So even though we had done all the work, even though before the interview we had the pre-chat and they sounded fine, they were great, actually during the interview, they were a highly vulnerable person. So you have to make those judgments as you're going along.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think it's time to say thank you much to Joe, Roshan, Lucia, and May. If you have any further questions, please feel free to hashtag and post their questions. But thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
on to the
Thank
next
you very
session.
much.
Thank you.